I'm delighted to welcome you to our webinar entitled Curating Your Life, Ending the Struggle for Work-Life Balance with presenter Gail Golden. Gail Golden helps people hit peak performance and become better leaders by drawing on her unique cross-background perspective. As a licensed psychologist and an MBA holding entrepreneur, Gail understands both the emotions and the economics that successful C-suite executives must master. Gail's book, Curating Your Life, was published by Rowman and Littlefield in April 2020. This book is based on what she's learned over more than 2 decades of helping leaders of all types maximize their achievements. Curating Your Life is full of advice on how to direct your energy towards identifying and accomplishing your most important goals. Gail is the principal of Gail Golden Consulting, an international network of senior management psychologists and consultants. She serves on the Women's Board of the University of Chicago and has been elected to the International Women's Forum and coordinates Chicago Coaching Roundtable, a local network of leading executive coaches. Now that is certainly enough from me. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce our presenter today, Gail Golden.
Thank you very much, Sam. And it's really a pleasure to be with you today and with Chicago alumni. I am a University of Chicago alumna. I graduated from the college in 1973. Sam and I were just talking before the presentation about memories of the college at that time. So I'm excited to have the opportunity to spend some time with you this afternoon and talk a little bit about a topic that I have been very interested in over the last few years. I'm going to start, though, by previewing the topic and sharing with you some thinking that I did a while back about what, for me, would constitute the perfect workday. What would the perfect workday look like for me? And here's what I came up with. I would wake up refreshed. I would take a quiet moment to look forward to the day. I would eat good meals and work hard. I would get stuff done that matters. I would enjoy my coworkers. I'd get some exercise somewhere along the way. I'd have some good time with family and friends. I would learn something new. I'd appreciate my good fortune. I'd have some fun. And I would go to bed at a reasonable hour and sleep well. Now, that's my perfect day. Yours might have something else in it that I didn't mention or might not have some of the elements that I have. But I think it's worthwhile to think about what that day looks like and then to ask ourselves the question, how often do I have a day like that? And what could I do to make those days happen more often? Sam, next slide, please. So that's what we're going to be talking about this afternoon, curating your life, ending the struggle for work-life balance. As Sam mentioned, that's the title of my book that was just published, and it is a topic that I've been thinking long and hard about for a long time. Next slide, please. So here's the story on my career, very briefly. I started out as a clinical psychologist. And for many years, I worked as a psychotherapist, helping people with all kinds of serious psychological and life challenges. And mid-career, I decided that I was getting stale and that it was time for me to do something different. But I valued what I had learned about how to help people change and what makes people tick. I wanted to start thinking about some different problems. And I got interested in how psychology might be helpful to business leaders. I had the good sense to recognize that if I wanted to work in that area, I needed to learn something about business first. So that's when I went back and got my MBA. And so in the second half of my career, I've been working as a leadership consultant and an executive coach, primarily with very senior leaders in medium and large organizations. So the two halves of my career are very different in many ways, and the clientele that I worked with, very different in many ways. But there was one problem that I kept hearing about right across all those years of working in those two different settings. And frankly, it was a problem I was confronting in my own life as well, which was the challenge of feeling constantly overworked, exhausted, inadequate, and not meeting my own and other people's expectations. And I thought, now, isn't that interesting? It doesn't matter if you're a stay-at-home parent or the CEO of a global company. You are likely going to be talking to me about that problem. And meanwhile, we've been talking about work-life balance forever. And I've never met anyone who has a balanced life. I've met people who look as if they do. But believe me, in my office, I start hearing about the ways in which their life doesn't feel balanced to them at all. So I thought, this work-life balance thing, it's not working for us. We need to find another way to think about how to organize our energy so that we don't feel exhausted and inadequate all the time. Next slide, please. So I came up with a different framework, what I call curating your life. And I want to start, as I talk about this, by talking about a couple of the fundamental concepts here. The first is, this is not about time management. One of my favorite books is a great book called The Power of Full Engagement. And the authors of that book talk about the fact that you cannot manage time. You get 24 hours a day. There's nothing you can do about it. It just keeps coming. So instead of talking about managing time, let's talk about managing our energy. How do I want to spend my energy? What do I want to focus my energy on? Now, there are two aspects to that. One is living in a way which maximizes my energy capacity so that I have as much energy to work with as possible. But even if you live right, even if you get good sleep and eat healthy food and hang out with people who support you and love you, you still are going to have a finite amount of energy. So it's also about making choices about how you spend your energy and recognizing that no matter how hard you try, that energy is going to be finite. So then I started to think about what does a curator do? Curator works for a museum. The museum director comes to the curator and says, I want you to put together an exhibit. The first thing that the curator has to get very clear about is, what's the exhibit about? What is this exhibit supposed to communicate? What do we want it to say? What is the focus of the exhibit? The museum is full of all kinds of fabulous and beautiful things. But if the curator puts everything in the museum into the exhibit, it's going to be a cluttered mess. So first of all, what is the exhibit about? And then the curator has to make three difficult choices. The first one is, what is not going to go in my exhibit? It might be beautiful, it might be valuable, it might be historically relevant, but it doesn't fit in this exhibit. Doesn't mean I have to throw it away. I might put it in the storeroom, but it's not going to go in my exhibit. The second decision is what's going to go in the exhibit, but it's not the main thing. It's going to go off in the side room somewhere. If people are really interested, they can go and look at it, but it's not the focus of the exhibit. And the third decision then is, what are the one or two or three really important central pieces that I want to be the focus of the exhibit, what people see when they first walk in, what goes on the poster for the exhibit. And I thought to myself, what would happen if I started thinking about energy the way the curator thinks about the exhibit? First of all, I would have to figure out, what is my life exhibit about? What matters to me? What's important? What's central? What are the main values and commitments that my life exhibit needs to focus on? And then I've got to make those tough choices. I've got to look at how I'm spending my energy. And there are going to be some things there that I think, yeah, you know what? That's a good thing, but it doesn't fit in my exhibit. It's not relevant to what my exhibit is about. Maybe I'll be able to do it later, but for now, it doesn't fit. And then the second decision for many people is even harder, which is, what am I going to do? It has to be in my life exhibit, but it just has to be good enough. It doesn't have to be great. It doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to be good enough. In fact, when I really want to challenge people, I say, that you need to embrace mediocrity. You have to allow yourself to be mediocre in some of the things that you do. Because here's the good news. If you say no to the things that don't belong, and you learn to be just good enough at the things that are only of medium importance, you will have the energy for the things that are your greatness, the things that really matter, the things you are meant to do with your life. And you won't have to feel exhausted and inadequate all the time. Now, the model is pretty simple. Doing it is complicated. And that's really what the heart of my book was about, and what I'm going to talk about a little bit with you today. May I have the next slide, please? So the first challenge then is figuring out what is my exhibit about. And that is unique to each person. It also, by the way, changes over the course of your lifespan, and we'll talk some about that a little bit later. The focus of your exhibit is really, in my mind, about 4 things. The first is my values. What do I judge to be important? What kind of person do I want to be? Who are the people that I admire? What are my values? Then the second is, what are my talents? What am I good at? What do I have a natural affinity for? Where do my skills and abilities and talents lie? The next thing is opportunity. You know, we like to believe that anybody can be anything if they just want it badly enough. But the truth is that opportunities matter, and they limit us in some cases. So looking around and saying, you know, gee whiz, you know, I would really like to be a ballerina, but there are no opportunities for me to get that kind of training right now. So maybe I need to figure out another path for myself. And finally, what is my passion? What turns me on? What gets me out of bed in the morning? Values, talents, opportunities, and passion will help you to figure out what your exhibit is supposed to be about. Next slide, please. Okay, now as I said, after that, you got an idea of what your exhibit is about. What are the 1 or 2 or 3 things that are really, really important to you? Then you have to make that tough decision about what you are not going to do. So I'm going to give you 2 quick examples of that from my own life. I started my professional career before I had my first child, and then that first baby came along. And sometime after he was born, I sat down one day and I made a list of all the things that I wasn't doing anymore since the baby was born. And there were a lot of things on that list. There were home-based things like I used to sew my own clothes. I had stopped doing that. I used to send out holiday cards every year. I wasn't doing that anymore. But also there were professional things. I wasn't going to professional conferences. I wasn't doing as good a job as staying up to date with all the journals in my field. There were a lot of ways in which, a lot of things that I had stopped doing because that baby was in my life. So that's one example of saying no to things. The other one is much more recent. I was just recently approached by a colleague whom I really, really admired, who asked me to take a leadership role in a professional organization. And I was very tempted. And then I said, Gail, you just wrote a book about this. So sit back and say, what is my exhibit about right now? Okay? Right now, first of all, my exhibit is about keeping my business afloat in a tough economic time. Secondly, it's about getting the word out about my book. And third, it's about being the best grandmother I know how to be. Those are the big 3 things in my exhibit right now. Now, how would leading this professional organization be relevant to those 3 things? It isn't. It isn't. It might be a fun thing to do, but it doesn't fit in my exhibit. And so I had to say no to him. So that gives you an idea of the kinds of things I'm talking about here. Next slide, please. How do you decide what should go onto your no list? Here's a simple 2x2 chart. Take a look at whether it makes you happy and whether it seems very important to you. Now, 2 of these cells are relatively easy. If something makes me really happy and I think it's highly important, that makes good sense to keep it in my exhibit. If it doesn't make me happy and it's not highly important to me, that's pretty easy to say no, that goes in the storeroom for now. It's the other two cells that are trickier, the things that make me happy but aren't very important, or the things that don't make me happy but are very important. And those are where it's a challenge to figure out whether it goes into the exhibit or whether it doesn't. Next slide, please. Once you've made the decision about what doesn't go in your exhibit, you then have the challenge of figuring out how are you going to say no to things that you want to do or that people want you to do. And that's hard. People don't like it when you say no to them. So there are a few things I think that can be helpful here. The first one is, of course, some of this stuff we can delegate. There are things that I don't want or cannot do myself, but I can get somebody else to do them. I can pay them, or I can ask them, or I can convince them. I can turn it over to somebody else. So delegation is a really important skill. And being good at delegation is tricky, both in your work life and in your home life, but it's a skill worth learning about. Then there's the obnoxious roommate. That's the voice inside your head that tells you what a loser you are, how everybody else manages to get this done. Why can't you? You must be a lazy slob. You must be an incompetent idiot. And we all have that voice inside our heads, and we have to learn how to deal with that voice. And there are ways to do that. One of the easy ways is to challenge myself and say, wait a minute, if I was looking at somebody else's life and they were making the choice that I'm thinking of making, would I be saying to them, well, you're a lazy slob. You ought to be able to figure out how you can do that. What's the matter with you? Why are you so incompetent? Probably not. We are usually much meaner to ourselves than we are to other people. So learning how to talk back to that obnoxious roommate is an important part of learning how to say no to the things that don't belong in my exhibit. As I said, sometimes people don't like you saying no to them. They may be critical, so the criticism may not just come from your own head, but from outside yourself, and learning how to deal with that is a necessary part of the skill as well. And I would say that when you have to have these conversations with somebody that you're going to say no to them, you should practice that. You should plan out in advance. How are you going to have the conversation? So, for example, with my colleague who asked me to head up the professional association, I thought it through and I thought, I really like him. I respect him. I want to continue to have a good relationship with him. I want him to ask me again if he's got a different project in mind, but I also want him to be really clear that I'm saying no to this one. Now, how do I craft the conversation to meet those objectives? And I thought it through in my head before I reached out to him. Another piece of effectively saying no, is don't over-explain or over-apologize. I like the word bandwidths, and sometimes I will just say to people, I'm really sorry, I would love to do that, but I just don't have the bandwidths right now. That's not giving them any detail, but it is saying a clear no. And finally, I do think that it's very important to use the right channel to say no. And typically, especially if it's going to be a touchy conversation, don't use texting or email for this kind of conversation. At best, we can have those conversations face-to-face, since right now that's very limited. Preferably a video call or even just an auditory call are better than those other forms of communication in terms of reducing misunderstanding. Next slide, please. Now, as I said, for many of us, it's the mediocrity piece that's really hard. I mean, we grew up with messages. I mean, very few parents say to our children, it's okay to just do a halfway job on that, or, just slop it through as best you can. No, we say to our kids, always do your best. Work to your highest standards. We have that saying in our culture, the good is the enemy of the great, which, by the way, I think is nonsense. I think the good is the friend of the great, because if you let yourself be just good at some things, that leaves you the energy to be great at the things that are really focal for you. But as I said, for many of us, accepting mediocrity is really hard. So what's the result of that? The truth is, for all of us, in much of what we do is mediocre. Nobody is great at everything that they do. Not even Leonardo da Vinci was great at everything he did. So we are mediocre at a lot of things. And then we waste our energy feeling inadequate and guilty about that instead of saying, that's my choice. I've decided I'm going to be a mediocre housekeeper. I've decided I'm going to be a mediocre jogger or a mediocre guitar player or mediocre at sending holiday cards, whatever the case may be. And owning that then frees up energy that is wasted on feeling guilty and lousy about ourselves. Next slide, please. Okay, so how do you do this? How do you navigate being just good enough at some of the things that you do in your life? One of the places that you can start as you're looking at the ways in which you are spending your energy is ask yourself 5 questions. The first one is this activity important to me? On a scale of 1 to 10, how much does this matter to me? Second, is it important to others I care about or who are influential in my life? My partner, my mother, my boss, my good friend. Does this matter to people who have a significant role in my life? Question 3, what will happen if I do this to a mediocre standard? That's an important one because sometimes when you look at that squarely, you think, you know what? Nothing will happen. It won't make any difference to anybody if I give this an 80% effort instead of a 100% effort. Next question, does this activity make me happy? And on a scale of 1 to 10, how happy? And the last one is, whose standards matter to me on this task? My own or somebody else's? In some cases, I have to meet other people's standards, and especially in our professional lives, there are standards and expectations that we need to meet. And in some cases, it really is our own standards. And we have the freedom to adjust those and to be a little bit less demanding of ourselves. So those are the 5 questions. I also think it's very valuable to calculate the ROI, the return on investment. How much energy, how much more of my energy does it take to do this to 100% than it would to do it to 80% or to 50%? And is that investment of my energy worth it in terms of the outcome and in terms of the impact? Sometimes it is, but sometimes it really isn't. And that ROI mindset can help us make these decisions. And finally, one of the great discoveries that I have made is when you decide what you're going to be mediocre in, don't tell people. Just quietly go about doing it. Most people will never notice because they aren't watching your performance as carefully as you are. So a lot of times you can just decide, hey, you know what? I'm not going to put as much energy into that. I'm going to back off from that. And no one is ever going to notice the difference. So don't go announcing it. Just make the decision on your own. Next slide, please. Okay. So you've done those 2 things. You have eliminated things from your life, from your schedule that really do not fit into your exhibit at this time. And you have faced up to and embraced the notion that there are going to be things in your exhibit that are going to be just good enough. And that's good enough. And now you're looking at the things that are your greatness, the things that really matter, the things that you were meant to do. First of all, there's the challenge, of course, to figure out what those things are. And then how do you actually go after them? So the first point that I want to mention about this is that greatness and being famous are not necessarily the same things. Lots of people are famous for the thing that they're great at, but there are lots of people who are great who are not famous for that, or who are famous for something that isn't great at all. They're, notorious, or they're famous for a mistake they made, or for a crime that they were the victim of, or something like that. So great and famous is not the same thing. And one of my favorite examples of that, one of the kinds of true greatness that I have seen, back in the day when I was working as a psychotherapist, I was often working with clients who came from absolutely terrible backgrounds, childhood situations, abuse, neglect, poverty, abandonment. And they were scarred from those experiences. And yet, they were living, they were working, they were making relationships, they were contributing to their community, they were making their lives work. And sooner or later, I would often ask them, how do you explain that? How do you explain that you came from what you came from, and here you are being the kind of person that you're being? How did that happen? And every single time I asked that question, the answer was, there was this person. There was a person who made the difference to me. The neighbor lady who let me go over to her house for dinner and sit with her family. The school teacher who made me believe that I was worth something. Somebody in my life who made me feel that I was valuable and that I mattered. I get choked up whenever I talk about this because it's so powerful. And it's powerful because, first of all, that is greatness as far as I'm concerned. Those people changed the trajectory of a child's life. But the fascinating thing is they probably don't even know that they did that. They were just being decent human beings. And yet the impact of what they did was unimaginable. So that's an example of greatness that is never going to get you fame. But it sure is important, and it surely does make a difference. One of the ways to figure out greatness is to think about your legacy. What do you want to be remembered for? I read the obituaries sometimes, and it's fascinating to see what's mentioned in the obituaries. Most often, it's, of course, about people's family connections. But often there are other things in there as well. People's greatness, the things they did that mattered and made a difference. What do you want your life to be remembered for? I think greatness comes also at the intersection of some different things, as I mentioned, in terms of figuring out what your exhibit is about. And the big three for me with greatness are talent, opportunity, and dedication. So again, your talents, the gifts that you were given is one piece of this formula. The opportunities that are available to you. But that third piece is dedication. My husband is a musician, and he trains music students. And he has told me that he can tell very quickly how much talent a student has. But what really predicts whether they're going to be a great musician or not isn't their talent. It's their dedication. It's their work ethic. It's how badly they want it. That's what makes the difference. So dedication is a very big part of this formula. Now, you can have talent and opportunity and dedication and be really clear about what it is you're trying to be great at. And that still doesn't mean that the road is necessarily going to be easy. And one of the things that people often ask me about at this point is procrastination. I get up in the morning and I'm determined that I'm going to work on whatever my greatness is today. And by, 5 o'clock in the afternoon, or these days with COVID, it's often 3 o'clock in the afternoon, I realize, you know what? I've been wasting time. I've been lollygagging. I've been distracted. I've been doing everything except working on what I said I was going to be doing today. How do I manage that procrastination? How do I keep myself on track? The good news is psychologists have done a lot of research on this, and there are a number of tactics that you can use. Many of them are in my book. I will share one of them with you that's a useful tactic. It's called chunking, which means that instead of looking at the whole gigantic task and thinking, oh my gosh, I can never get this done, you chunk it into small bite-sized pieces. And you say, all I need to get done now is this small first step. I'm not going to worry about the rest of it right now. and you chunk it into manageable pieces, that makes it easier to stay on task and not get overwhelmed and not procrastinate. I also want to comment, though, that sometimes procrastination gives you important information. Before I wrote my book, Curating Your Life, I actually set out to write a different book. I picked a topic and I said, I'm going to write this book. And 4 months went by and I had not written one word, which is very unusual for me. And I thought, whoa, what is going on here? Why am I not doing what I said I would do? And toward the end of that time, I had the opportunity to give a keynote address. And the keynote address was about curating your life. And it was one of those times that the address was just really successful. The audience was with me. It was a very exciting moment. And as I stepped down from the podium, I thought, holy cow, I've been trying to write the wrong book. I'm not interested in that book. I'm interested in this book. So I put aside that project. I started to work on curating your life. And within a few months, I had a first draft. So sometimes procrastination tells you that you are trying to make yourself do the wrong thing. Sometimes you need to just kick your own butt and get going. But sometimes you need to sit back and say, maybe there's something else I'm supposed to be doing with my time. This is not it. A couple of other quick things about going after your greatness. You need to think about what kind of effort the work will require. What do you have to learn in order to be great at this? When I decided I wanted to become a leadership consultant, I had to go back to school and spend 2 years in an MBA program before I had the basics on what it is about running a business that I needed to know. You need to think about, how am I going to stay great? How am I going to sustain this over the long term? What tools do I need to become or to stay great? What support do I need from other people? And how do I measure greatness? How am I going to know when I feel, when I believe that I'm doing something and I'm great at it? And the other quick pointer I would give you is that in most cases, I find that becoming great means you have to get out of your comfort zone. You cannot play it safe. You have to take risks. You have to push yourself hard. You have to do things that are difficult and scary in order to get great at something. And that's what the path to greatness involves. Okay. Next slide, please. I mentioned before that over the years of your life, you're going to need to recurate. Those of you who went to the University of Chicago in Hyde Park, you know about the Museum of Science and Industry. When I was a little girl, going to the Museum of Science and Industry was like my favorite thing in the world to do. I thought it was the most fantastic place. And I had specific exhibits that I loved to go to over and over again. A few years back, I went there with my granddaughter. And you know what? It was different. Some of the exhibits that I really loved as a child were gone. And other ones had changed. And I'll tell you, I was in a little bit of a snit about that, because I wanted to be exactly the same as when I was a child. And then I realized the museum couldn't stay the same. The things that excited me when I was a little girl aren't the same things that children are going to respond to. Now the world has moved on. And fortunately, the museum had changed its exhibits over time. Not all of them, but some of them. Same thing is true in our life. If your life exhibit is the same when you're 65 as when you're 25, you got a problem. That's chances are that's a life that's pretty empty and pretty stale. Recuration usually happens, in my experience, when one or both of two things happen. One is sometimes outside forces force us to change. COVID is a good example. Everybody has had to recurate their lives over these last few months, because a lot of things we were doing before we can't do, and there are things we have to do now that we didn't have to do before. And what I'm finding with COVID is that not only are people recurating their life in the short term, the here and now, but they are also beginning to think differently about how they want their lives to be when the world opens up again. It's leading to longer term recurating thoughts and conversations. So sometimes it's the outside world that forces us to recurate, and sometimes it's inside forces, things that change within us, things that used to satisfy us that don't anymore, or new and exciting avenues that appear to us and we say, I want to go after that. And sometimes it's both. And so then you got to shake things up and reorganize your exhibit and figure out what needs to get moved around, moved into the front, moved into the side room, take it out entirely. And that is both exciting and difficult. Next slide, please. I want to take a minute to share with you one of my favorite examples of greatness and of what greatness looks like. I'm going to put on my glasses because I'm reading from my book at the moment. I want to talk with you about the Watts Towers in Los Angeles. The first time you see them, you cannot believe your eyes. You're driving through one of the bleakest urban neighborhoods in America, the Watts neighborhood of Los Angeles, and there, against the horizon, is a collection of fantastic metal structures. They seem completely out of place and otherworldly. And then as you draw near, you discover they are totally covered with the wildest mosaics. What the heck is going on here? The Watts Towers are the largest work of art on the planet that was built by one person alone. That person was Simon Rodia, a tiny, illiterate Italian immigrant who worked in construction. In 1921, Rodia decided he wanted to do something big. He bought a small lot in Watts near the train station so people could see his work, and for the next 33 years, he spent every moment of his free time building the towers. He used no scaffolding, no power tools, no welding, and no bolts. The Watts Towers are challenging on several levels. Let's face it. What kind of nut spends 33 years of his life building something bizarre and useless? Yet on the other hand, what a magnificent achievement. Rodia wanted to do something big, and by golly, he did it. The towers are breathtakingly beautiful, and many people find them spiritually inspiring. They are the embodiment of passion and individuality, and once you have seen them, it is hard to stop thinking about them. That's a little bit about the Watts Towers. And if you are in LA or you've been to LA or you're going to LA, I recommend that you go and see them. They're pretty spectacular. Next slide, please. As you're working through curating your life, I'm going to share with you what I call the magic question. Very few of us lead lives that have a lot of empty space in them. So your life's exhibit is full. And when you get offered something else or another responsibility or focus for your energy comes onto the horizon, you need to ask yourself the question, what am I going to do less of? What am I going to do less of? And if you cannot think of something that you are willing to do less of, then you cannot take on the new commitment. Because, again, your energy is finite, and it won't work to keep piling more and more on any more than it works to try to cook 17 pots on a 4-burner stove. It doesn't work. Things get ruined when you do that. So what am I going to do less of is the magic question. Next slide, please. The last thing I want to comment on quickly is that curating your life is frankly a tough discipline. It requires making intentional choices and then living with those choices. Nobody can be disciplined about everything all the time. Every culture has a day in the calendar where you get to break the rules. And all of us need to bust loose once in a while. The trick is to learn to bust loose in ways that are not destructive or overwhelming, to give ourselves permission to be just a little bit bad and then pull ourselves back on track. Whether that's breaking the diet that I committed to, whether it's letting myself fool around when I said I was going to work on an important task today, giving yourself that room to bust loose a little bit is part of what enables people to stay on track with their discipline. And it's a really important part of the puzzle. Next slide, please. So what do I want you to remember from this presentation today? First, life is not a marathon, it's a series of sprints. It's about working hard and taking breaks in between. Second, don't try to manage your time, focus on managing your energy. Third, don't compare your own insides to other people's outsides. Those people who look as if they've got it all together, they're just faking it better than you are. And finally, to maximize your productivity and joy, learn how to say no, how to accept when good enough is good enough, and how to go for your greatness. Next slide, please. The last thing I'd ask you to do is to think about the ideas that I put forward today and some of the tactics, and think about one thing that you will do different as a result of this presentation. Not the whole shebang, but one thing. By the way, I wouldn't mind terribly if the one thing was you're going to go buy my book, but you can also think about other things that you're going to do differently. I'm going to let myself be mediocre at, I don't know, not folding the laundry for 5 days after I wash it, or whatever the case may be. Where am I going to allow myself to be mediocre? What's the one thing that I'm going to do different? And make a commitment to take that away and do that one thing. Next slide, please. So I'm done now with the presentation. And Sam, I think you probably have gathered some questions and comments and fierce arguments from people. So I would love to engage with that for a little while.
No fierce arguments yet, but
Okay.
that's the session's not over.
Okay.
If you haven't submitted your question yet via the Q&A function on Zoom, please do so. We have one here, and it actually pertains to what you were just talking about, Gail.
Okay.
Some of the topics we've covered today are big and maybe sometimes a little bit hard to think about managing all at once. So
Yes.
Our question here from Nicole, how do you recommend getting started with curating your life? What is one thing that I can start with right now?
Yeah, you know, it's a good question, but I can't answer it because what the one thing is might be different for Nicole than it is for other people. You know, for some people, it may be that I've been drifting and I have no idea what my greatness is, and I need to start by talking to some people and figuring that out, or taking some kind of online self-assessment tool, or whatever the case may be. For other people, it is, I've been trying to be great at too many things. I need to think about one thing I could take off my plate, move out of my exhibit. So this curating your life is a very individual process, and no one else has the answers for you. It is not a one size fits all. And as I said, it keeps changing anyway. So I guess what I would say is this is worth doing. When you curate your life, life gets both more joyful and more productive. So figure out what that first step is and take it.
And you just mentioned self-assessment tools. We got a follow-up question here. Do you have any self-assessment tools, resources, quizzes that you would recommend?
You know, I do. One of the things I did early on was I just went on to Google and said, you know, values assessment. And there are a number of quickie self-help tools that you can fill out and that give you immediate results. Look, I have a background in psychology. I know that these are probably not highly well-researched and statistically well-designed tools, but that doesn't really matter for this purpose. It will give you some ideas about how your answers shape up in terms of what you're saying that may help you to focus on what's important to you. And then there are other tools that are more carefully designed and more thoughtful. Again, not to flog the book to death, but there is a section in the book about some of those tools and the kinds of information that you can gain from them. There are other ways too. Talk to people who know you and ask them, what do you think I'm good at? Where do you, what would you like to see me doing more of? Getting ideas from the people who care about you and think well of you. Listening to where your energy comes from. I spent one evening once thinking about when I go home at the end of the day and I think I love my job. What happened that day? And I was able to pinpoint what were the things that made me love my job. And they weren't specific to my job. So those were things that I thought, okay, any job that I take, they better have those things in them. Otherwise, I'm not going to love them. And for me, the three were doing work that matters to somebody, learning something new, and landing a big new project. I like the business development part of my work. So I like going out and finding new clients and getting new projects that I can work on. So getting new business, learning something new, doing work that really makes a difference. Those are my three things. Any job that I'm going to love is going to have those three things in it. So that kind of self-assessment can work as well.
And I think this next question dovetails nicely into this idea of self-assessment. Do you have any recommended steps for people who may be at a loss as to what is their passion, what belongs in the front of their exhibit? What are the steps to finding your passion?
Well, I think we've been talking about that a little bit. I guess what I would add to that is talk to people. Either talk to people who are in a job that you think you might really enjoy or that looks really interesting to you, or talk to people, as I said, about how they see you and what they might see as a path that, what do you think I'd be good at? And I find that a lot of people are really open to that kind of conversation. If you say, look, can I have a half an hour of your time? I often get students, either advanced undergraduate students or people in graduate programs, who reach out to me through LinkedIn or somewhere and say, you know what, Gail, I think I'm interested in doing what you're doing. Can we talk about that? And I'll spend half an hour talking with people who want to have that kind of conversation, partly because a lot of people helped me when I was looking for my paths. A lot of people have helped my kids when they were looking for their paths. So if I can help other people, I'm happy to do that. And I think that's an attitude that a lot of people share. So yeah, go ask people would be part of my advice.
I think that's great advice. And if I can add to it, your UChicago Alumni Network is a great group of people that you can turn to.
Yeah.
I know from my own experience and from what I've seen fellow alumni do, reaching out on LinkedIn, using the alumni directory, those are great ways to find people that you can turn to with these big questions.
I wish I had thought of that. That's a good addition.
We're working in tandem here, Gail. All right, here is another question that I think is relatable to a lot of people. I'm so easily susceptible to pressure from my friends, family, and coworkers. I find it hard to say no, even to the smallest things. How will my relationships change if I begin standing up to those around me and begin working on saying no?
Oh, it's a good question. And I guess what I would, as I've been saying before, is to some sense, it depends. But my first thought is, if I've got a friendship or a relationship, and I go to that person and I say, I appreciate the invitation, or, I know that it would be helpful to you if I did this, but I have to say no to that right now. And that person says, well, then screw you. I don't want to be your friend anymore. I got to think maybe that wasn't much of a friendship to begin with. Now, maybe the person will try to talk me into it. Fair enough. Maybe they will talk me into it. Who knows? But maybe I'll stand my ground and say, you're right. It's really appealing. If I had the bandwidth, I'd be doing it. Or I might say, I understand that you're excited about that project, but it really isn't my cup of tea. And I don't want to be part of it. So both being able to stand your ground. And there are tactics for that as well. Way back when, there was something called assertiveness training, which sort of fell out of fashion. It was a big fad for a while, I don't know, back in the 70s or the 80s or something like that. But there are tactics in assertiveness training that are relevant to this, of how to respectfully and firmly stand your ground and say no. So I guess what I would say is some relationships may be ended when you say no. Maybe they weren't relationships that were all that solid to begin with. Most relationships can withstand a no, and the person will maybe be disappointed, but they'll move on, and there'll be other opportunities to say yes. This is not easy. Saying no to people is not easy. And again, partly because of their reaction, but often in many cases because of what my own head is saying to me.
Yes, I
and
think
that
you're
piece,
spot
that
on.
piece I can manage. I can learn to say "shut up" to my own head, and that's a skill that's worth learning to do.
Yeah, that's a great reminder for all of us. I can say personally, as a young woman in the workplace, that's a skill that I am still working on myself. Here's another great question. I find it easier to figure out my passions to curate my exhibit outside of work compared to in my career. How should work fit into my exhibit?
That is a good question, because I'll tell you something. I know people for whom work has nothing to do with their passion. Work is the means to the end. I work to make enough money so that I can pursue my passion. And that's okay. For some people, that exhibit works just fine. I had a client years ago. She was some sort of administrative assistant. Her passion was community theater. And that's where she put her energy and her excitement, and the job just was enough so that she could pay her rent and go off and work in community theater. I would say, in my experience, that's the exception. For most of us, we do want our work to be connected to our passions somehow. And so then it's a matter either of figuring out what my passion is and figuring out how I can find a job that has something to do with that passion, or figuring out how within my job I can find ways to connect with and work from the place of my passion. When I was a girl, I was going to be a movie star. I was going to be an actor, and I love performing. I became a therapist, and the joke that I told on myself was I used to want to be an actress, and now I'm an audience, which was true to a large extent, except I also taught a lecture course that had 500 students in it. And that gave my theatrical side a possibility of leaping out. So I found a place where I could express that passion, that part of myself. And there are ways that we can do that.
It's great help. Wonderful. Well, we have reached the end of our session today. Thank you so much, Gail, for these insights, this inspiration. I certainly leave here feeling hopeful and feeling ready to make a change in my own personal exhibit.
Well, thank you for the opportunity. I want to end with just one final thought, which is curating your life is not easy, but it is doable, and it will lead to a more joyful, more productive life. It can be done. I've seen it.